The radio crackled, cutting through the quiet hum of the ambulance cabin. Unit 5, priority response. Male, mid-50s, severe chest pain, difficulty breathing. Logan barely had time to glance at Mason before his partner was already flipping the sirens on. Chest pain. Every paramedic knew what that really meant. A heart attack. A ticking time bomb. And if they weren't fast, someone was about to die. "Address?" Mason barked. Logan scanned the MDT screen. His stomach dropped. Across town. Too far. He grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, do we have an update on the patient?" The reply came fast, and Logan knew from the dispatcher's voice that this was already going bad. "Caller reports patient has collapsed. CPR in progress." Mason swore under his breath and gunned it through an intersection. Logan's pulse kicked up. If the patient was already down, they were in a race against death. They needed to get there now. Mason barely hit the brakes before Logan was already throwing open the ambulance door. The house was too quiet. Porch lights flickered, casting uneasy shadows against the siding. The front door was wide open, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond it. But there was no movement, no shouting, no frantic family members running toward them. Just that eerie, unnatural silence. Then, a noise from inside, a choked, desperate sob. Logan ran. Inside, the air was thick with something heavy. The kind of weight that pressed against your lungs, making every breath harder. And then, he saw them. A woman was kneeling on the floor, her hands trembling violently as she pressed down on a man's chest. He wasn't moving. Her sobs hitched, gasping out between compressions. "He was talking to me. He said he was in pain. And then he just... Logan didn't let her finish. He moved fast, pushing her gently aside and replacing her hands with his own. The man's skin was gray, lips tinged blue, and his chest didn't rise, didn't move, no pulse. Logan barely felt Mason drop beside him, already tearing open the med bag. He forced himself into autopilot, hands locked. Push hard, push fast. 1, 2, 3, 4. The woman clutched at his arm, her fingers cold, desperate. "Please," she whispered, voice broken. "Please bring him back." Logan didn't answer, because he didn't know if he could. Logan's palms pressed down hard on the man's chest, his arms locked as he counted out compressions. 1 dot, 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 2, 3 dots, Nangu. His ribs cracked beneath the force, a sound that never stopped making Logan's stomach twist, no matter how many times he heard it. But it meant the compressions were deep enough. It meant they still had a chance. Mason ripped open the defibrillator pads, slapping them onto the man's clammy chest. The heart monitor flickered, its jagged lines revealing the worst. No rhythm, no electrical activity. Flatline, not even a shockable rhythm. Logan barely had time to process it before Mason barked, pushing one of epi. The needle plunged into the IV line, sending a rush of adrenaline through the man's veins. "Please work." Logan kept pumping, sweat rolling down his back. The wife's sobs grew louder, her hands shaking as they hovered over her husband's lifeless body. "Is he breathing? Tell me he's breathing." Logan ignored her because he couldn't lie to her, and because there was no time to explain that, no, he wasn't. But maybe, just maybe, they could still get him back. Shock advised. The words made Logan's heart jolt. Finally. Mason's fingers hovered over the defib button. "Clear!" The wife screamed as the man's body jerked violently from the shock. The heart monitor beeped, then flatlined again. Logan gritted his teeth. Again! Another shock. Another lifeless pulse check. Another nothing. He kept pushing compressions, pouring everything into each movement, begging the body to wake up. The monitor beeped wildly, a flicker of activity. Then another flatline. And then Logan knew. It was over. Logan's hands kept moving out of sheer desperation, compressing the man's chest over and over. Even though deep down, he already knew the truth. The heart monitor had been flat for too long. The adrenaline hadn't worked. The shocks hadn't worked. Nothing had worked. But stopping meant accepting it. Stopping meant giving up. And Logan didn't want to give up, because he could still feel the wife's eyes on him, still hear her soft, broken whispers. Please don't stop. But Mason was looking at him now too, and Logan knew what he was about to say. "Logan, Mason's voice was low, firm, final. "We have to call it." Logan's jaw clenched. His hands didn't stop. "Logan." His next compression came slower. The one after that even slower, until finally, his hands stilled. And in that terrible, suffocating silence, he forced himself to say the words. "Time of death, 11:42 p.m. The wife collapsed. It happened so fast that Mason barely caught her before she hit the floor. Her body shook with violent sobs, fingers clawing at Logan's arms, at Mason's uniform, at anything she could hold on to. "No, no, no, please, do something, do something." Logan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because he had done something. He had done everything, and it still wasn't enough. The house felt like a tomb. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting shadows on the man's motionless body. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something colder, something final. Mason was still kneeling beside the wife, speaking in a soft, steady voice Logan couldn't process. Because Logan was still staring at the body. A body that had been a living, breathing man less than 20 minutes ago. And now, he was just gone. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The words hit Logan harder than any punch he'd ever taken. The wife was staring at him now, eyes raw and swollen, voice barely above a whisper. "Why weren't you here sooner?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Logan had no answer. Logan stood frozen, the wife's broken words slicing into him like a blade. "Why didn't you come sooner?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because what the hell was he supposed to say? Traffic was bad. We were across town. We got here as fast as we could. None of it mattered. None of it would bring her husband back. Her small, shaking hands clenched into fists, pounding weakly against his chest. "You should have been here." Logan let her hit him, because a part of him agreed. Mason spoke softly, his voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the long shift. "Ma'am, I promise you, we got here as fast as possible." The wife let out a broken, gut-wrenching sob, her body folding in on itself. Logan looked away, because he knew that no words would ever make this moment better. They could leave a report, give her a number to call, offer their condolences. But at the end of the night, they would walk away, and she would stay here, alone. Mason gently pulled Logan aside. "You good? Number?" "Absolutely not." But Logan nodded anyway, because what else could he do? They packed up their gear in silence, rolling up the IV line, tucking away the defibrillator pads. Logan's hands were steady, but only because they had to be. His mind wasn't. His brain kept screaming, what if we'd been closer? What if they'd taken a different route? What if the lights had been green instead of red? What if they'd gotten there 1 minute earlier? 1 minute. Would that have made a difference? He would never know. And that was the worst part. Logan closed the ambulance doors harder than necessary. The sound echoed through the quiet street, cutting through the wife's muffled sobs inside the house. Mason climbed into the driver's seat without a word, and Logan slid into the passenger side, staring blankly at the dashboard. For a moment, neither of them moved. The radio crackled. "Unit 5, back in service?" Mason reached for the mic, then hesitated. Logan could see it in his face. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to acknowledge that the call was over, the job was done, and yet, somehow, it still didn't feel finished. But protocol didn't care about that. Mason exhaled and pressed the button. "Unit 5, back in service." The words tasted like ash in Logan's mouth. The drive back to the station was too quiet. Usually they talked about the game, about Logan's beat-up truck, about Mason's never-ending dating disasters. Not this time. This time, there was nothing to say. Logan stared out the window, watching the empty streets blur past, his reflection barely visible in the glass. He could still feel it, the weight of his hands pressing down on the man's chest. Still hear the wife's voice, raw and shaking. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Logan's hands curled into fists in his lap. Because no matter how fast they'd been, it still wasn't fast enough. Mason's voice finally broke the silence. "We did everything we could." Logan didn't answer. Mason sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "You know that, right?" Logan nodded, but it was a lie. Because knowing it and believing it were two different things. Back at the station, Logan went straight to the sink. He scrubbed his hands harder than he needed to, watching the water turn pink as the last traces of blood swirled down the drain. But it didn't help. It never helped. The blood was gone, but the guilt wasn't. And he knew it never would be. Logan kept scrubbing his hands, even though they were already clean. The water ran hot, scalding against his skin, but he didn't turn it down, because no matter how hard he scrubbed, the feeling wouldn't go away. The weight of the man's body under his hands, the way the ribs cracked beneath the compressions, the silence after the final shock when he knew, when they all knew, he was gone. Time of death, 11:42 p.m. The words pounded in his skull, over and over, like a cruel metronome that wouldn't stop ticking. Mason leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him. "You're gonna peel your skin off if you keep doing that." Logan didn't stop. Mason sighed. "We got another hour before shift change. You want to grab food?" Logan finally turned off the tap. He wasn't hungry. He was never hungry after a call like this. But Mason wasn't really asking about food. He was asking if Logan wanted to sit in silence somewhere other than the station. And Logan didn't. Because no matter where he went, he'd still hear the wife's voice in his head. "Why didn't you come sooner?" They sat in the ambulance instead. Mason was scrolling through his phone, pretending to be interested in whatever the hell he was looking at. Logan just stared at the dashboard clock, watching the seconds crawl by. Finally, Mason sighed. "You know, you don't have to carry this one." Logan let out a breath that was damn close to a laugh. Because that was a joke. They carried all of them, every single one, and some weighed more than others. Logan tapped his fingers against his knee, trying to shake the restlessness in his chest. "You think if we'd been closer, we could have saved him?" Mason didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "I don't know." Logan looked at him. Mason stared straight ahead, didn't blink, didn't look away. And Logan knew, in that moment, he was lying. He did know. They both did. And it was eating them alive. Part 8. The Final Echo. The sun was starting to rise when Logan finally got home. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at his front door. The world outside was quiet. The kind of peaceful silence that came before the city fully woke up. But inside Logan's head, it was anything but quiet. He could still hear the wife's sobs, still see her face, the exact moment she realized they weren't going to save him. Still hear her voice whispering in his skull like a ghost that refused to leave. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Logan closed his eyes, pressed his fingers to his temple, took a breath. Then he got out of the car, went inside, and locked the door behind him. Because it was over, but it didn't feel like it, and he knew it never would.